Hello everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. And today we are doing kind of a second follow-up show today. We, on Wednesday, with our rabbit reading that we do every Wednesday, read kind of an interesting book. It's a book called Luck by Jean Craig Head George. And it talks about a sandhill crane who has an encounter with a human when he is very young, and then talks about, his migration that he goes through his first year that he's alive. And so Lee read this on Wednesday, so you can go back and watch that. I'm not going to go through and read all of it again. And Angie talked yesterday a little bit about something called imprinting, which is about how animals kind of learn things. How they learn to figure out like what kind of animal they are and what sort of things they're supposed to be doing as far as like actually surviving in the wild. And so because this sandhill crane, Luck, had an encounter with a human when it was very young and spent some time with a human when it was very young. It kind of messed up the way it was learning how to navigate the route it needed to go to. And Angie talked a little bit about that yesterday as far as imprinting and acclimating to humans. But today I want to talk about something a little bigger, something that is affected by, or affects not just sandhill cranes, but the kind of bigger topic that's going on over the course of this book is it's sandhill cranes that are migrating from I think it's down in Texas or Louisiana originally is where he starts in the book, and he ends up making his way all the way up to Alaska. And it talks a lot in the book about, all these landmarks he's going past, how far he's traveling on his way. I think there's a map right up front here that traces the route. So yeah, starting down in Texas and flying all the way up to Alaska, and actually over even to Siberia is where he ends up eventually, over in Russia, and then comes all the way back down to Texas. Which is interesting because he talks in there about all the other cranes that are all doing the same thing. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how they, or why they do that, I guess, is part one, and then how do they know where to go, how do they know how to get there. And so the first thing is, like I said, talking about kind of how they, or why they know to do this. And you'll see a lot of birds do migrations. It's something you tend to see mostly with birds, or basically things that can fly, because it's really the only things that can travel a big enough distance for it to really matter, travel a big enough distance in a very timely fashion for it to really matter. But generally, when you're talking about animals that are migrating, they're usually doing it for weather reasons. And so us here in Minnesota, we have a lot of migratory animals here, ones that are only here in the summer, and then in the winter they all go south. And so kind of the classic examples that you'll see around here are a lot of the water birds. So things like our mallard ducks are migratory that we have here. We have the Canada geese, obviously, that always come around, pass through here. We even get sandhill cranes that come through here every once in a while as well. Snow geese. And so obviously these are animals that need to be migrating because they rely on water to do what they got to do. So a duck can't be a duck if the lake is frozen, so they go somewhere where the lake's not frozen, and then come back up here in the summer when our lakes aren't frozen. And like I said, you see a lot of animals do this. It's mostly birds tends to be the thing that does this the most. But what I also wanted to talk about here is, like I said, how it talks in this book about how the sandhill crane, the crane's name is Luck, that's why it's called Luck, and that he kind of feels this sort of compulsion to keep traveling, and he seemingly kind of recognizes these different spots that he stops at the whole time. It talks about stopping at the Platte River in Nebraska, for example, and even though he had never been there, he sort of recognized it and understood as a place that he should be, and it's all very vague, almost sort of mystical in the way it frames it in the book. And that's because, honestly, there's a lot of debate about how different birds do this in real life as well, and scientists don't have a really great understanding of how all these birds are exactly doing what they're doing. And there's a number of different models out there, and one of the most prominent ones, one of the ones that seems to make the most sense to me and it's a very prevalent model that a lot of people seem to rely on, is this idea that these migratory birds, are really good at sensing magnetic fields, basically. And so Earth, right here next to me, has what we would call magnetic poles on it. And so they are pretty close to like the geographic north and south pole here. So there's a physical north pole way up here, and there's a physical south pole way down here. But there's also what we would call the magnetic North and South Pole. And kind of weirdly, kind of unintuitively, the magnetic South Pole is actually up by the geographic North Pole, and the magnetic North Pole is down by the geographic South Pole. And so this is something that humans use to navigate too. I mean, if you've ever looked at or used a compass, it's relying on the same thing. And so I've got a couple other magnets around here, so we'll see how good these compasses are actually working right now. But the way a compass works is it has a magnetic piece of metal in there, little arrow, little light arrow, that is balanced on like a little pin. And so it's light enough that the magnetic pole of the Earth will actually direct the compass into a certain direction. And in the case of this one, the red arrow will point towards the magnetic North Pole of the Earth. And so the way we would use this is you would have it sitting in your hand flat in front of you. And then, like I said, that red, which hard to see from this angle probably for you, is going to be pointing north. And so I can go like that and say, okay, I'm not facing. It's gonna so as I'm moving it around here, it's gonna be the arrow's gonna be moving as well. So when I had it flat in my hand there, I had it oriented at north, or so north is kind of that way, which is right. That's about where north is. And so I can spin this and put my arrow under where north was, and I can say, okay, when I'm standing here looking directly at you, I'm not facing quite north, I'm facing a little bit northeast when I'm looking this way, which is correct. So this compass is working fine. And like I said, it's not magnetic north and geographic north aren't exactly the same. They line up pretty close to one another. Well, magnetic south and geographic north line up pretty close to one another. But one of the things that's interesting about the magnetic poles on the Earth is they actually move around just a little bit. And they move around relatively consistently. And so another thing that's kind of interesting use of these magnetic poles is, my background's in archaeology. Some of you who've watched for a while have known that. But one of the kind of really interesting things that uses this in archaeology is you can use it for dating archaeology sites as well. Specifically, if you know what a hearth is where you would do like your cooking in your house. It's like the bottom of a fireplace, basically. It's called a hearth. And the way a hearth works is usually you have stone in the bottom of it. And a lot of times the stones you're going to pick to be putting in your hearth are going to be ones that have little magnetic stuff in them as well. A lot of times it's these metamorphic rocks that have magnetic components in them. And when you start a fire on top of them, those fragments can get loose enough that they'll actually orient themselves very much like a compass will. And so and then when the rock cools down, it rehardens, and those little magnetic pieces in them are basically stuck oriented wherever north was at the time that the fire was lit. And so if you know where magnetic south was at the time, or across time, you can look at it and say, okay, I can go in this hearth fire and look at all the rocks in there and see where all the magnetic bits are pointing. Say, they're pointing this way, just a little different from where north is right now on my compass. And if I know what the record is of where magnetic north has been throughout history, I can get a pretty good idea of when that hearth fire was last lit, and they can tell me how old that site was. It's kind of interesting. But like I said, this is something that a lot of kind of magnetic fields are something that humans are not very good at sensing on our own. Like, we're quite bad at it compared to a lot of other animals. You'll see a lot of fish are very good at sensing magnetic fields as well. But like I said, birds seem to be one of these things that's very, very good at it, and it probably comes up a lot in their navigation. The other thing to think about, though, with something like a compass, is knowing which direction is north is great. But if you dropped me out in the middle of nowhere and told me, hey, get back to the Headwaters Science Center, you just have a compass, it's not going to help me out that much, because I don't know what direction the Headwaters Science Center is from where I am if you blindfold me and throw me in the back of a van and take me somewhere. So, like, I can say, yeah, north is that way, but if I don't know the Science Center is that way, what good does it do me? And so, something else that it is broadly thought that birds are maybe very capable of doing, and a lot of these migratory birds specifically are very capable of doing, is actually sensing the strength of magnetic fields as well. And so it just so happens that Earth's magnetic fields are strongest at the poles. So it's strong up at either end here, and then it gets weaker as you get towards the equator. And so if you know what direction north is, and you have a good sense of how strong the magnetic pole should be, or the magnetic field should be at a certain latitude, you can be like, okay, the magnetic field is weak here. I know north is that way, and I know the field's weak. That means I got to keep going further north. And so you don't just have a compass if you're a bird. You potentially have a compass as well as, I don't know if we have an instrument that senses the strength of magnetic fields. I'm sure it exists. I don't know what it's called off the top of my head, though. But the thought is that a lot of birds probably have that kind of built into them. And there's been a lot of experiments done with this. Like I said, it's something that humans have been trying to understand for a long time. This is a behavior that humans have even used. I mean, you've probably heard of things like carrier pigeons that were very prevalent in like World War I and before, as far as like carrying messages around. And so that's relying on the same type of thing where your birds have their specific spot that they know to go back to. So you can take your bird to you, you can tie a little message to its little ankle, and if you release it, it goes back to where it came from, kind of regardless of how far away you take it. And again, the thought is that basically they get acclimated to a certain spot and say, okay, this is how strong the magnetic field of the Earth is here, and I know north is that way when I am in this spot at this strength, and basically they orient themselves that way. One of the other things that's kind of cool that it talks about in this book a little bit is using the sun for navigation. And so it talks about, using the angle of the sun as far as knowing kind of when to be flying and when to be active and where to be flying, kind of using where the sun is in the sky. And that's something that is, again, very useful. And again, obviously something that humans use a lot is orienting based on the sun. And what's really handy about the sun, especially, too, is that it is on a pretty predictable time thing here. And so you can know where you're going, but you also got to know when to be going there. And so how long the sun is up during the day, where the sun is in the sky can tell you what time of year it is, besides using just something like temperature that can be very variable from year to year. Something like the sun's position in the sky is not going to be. And so a lot of birds will use signaling from the sun to tell them not just where they're going, but when they should be going there as well. And so I think that'll be a good little basic overview there. I guess something else. I brought these little magnets up just to talk a little bit about north and south poles. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as positive and negative poles too. You'll hear the terms like, two positive poles reject each other, opposites attract type of thing is associated with magnets. And so I can take this magnet and I can stick them together. And I don't know which side is the north and which side is the south on either of these magnets off the top of my head, but just the fact that they did actually stick together means that they're opposites. And you can see if I try and flip this one over and do the same thing, it does not stick. It wants to reject it. And like I said, that it plays into how this works as well, where I probably could even, I can stick a magnet here and basically steer the magnet around steer the compass around wherever I want it to. Gotta have it flat for it to work though. So it's kind of a tricky visual for a camera. But if I do it flat, put a magnet there, I can put it wherever I want, and then turn it back up. And so, like I said, that the red arrow there is attracted to south, basically. It's attracted to the magnetic south, not the geographic south. And so, by being attracted to the magnetic south, it points north. Again, I say kind of paradoxically. But yeah, that's kind of intro to magnets, intro to poles, intro to bird migration. And yeah, like I said, especially around here in Minnesota, we have a lot of birds that migrate. And so we talked about a lot of the waterfowl, but even things like some of our raptors that we have around here do some migrating as well. They don't all stick around all year. They don't all leave. Something like the great horned owls, some of them stay, some of them go, for example. And it's worth talking about, I guess, things like great horned owls as far as migrating too, because for a long time, one of the leading theories as far as how these birds were navigating was like largely based on smell. But a lot of birds don't have a very good sense of smell. Great horned owls famously basically don't have a sense of smell. It's what lets them hunt skunks so effectively. And so something like a great horned owl obviously isn't going to be using something like that when it's migrating because it doesn't have it. And so things like I said, magnetic poles and things like solar position is basically the way they do it. I said before we were getting started here, I was talking to Ariana a little bit about it, and she just said, "Yeah, it's instinct that's going to be doing it." Ariana's behind the camera today. She I'll let you know. She waved at you. You couldn't see her, but she did it. So, hi, chat, on behalf of Ariana. And I said, "Well, how's this happen?" And she said, "Well, instinct." And I said, "Yeah, there is a certain instinct to it." And like I said, it kind of talks about that in this book as well, where he feels this sort of compulsion to get up and be moving. Like I said, instinct can explain a behavior happening, but it doesn't necessarily explain the mechanism that actually makes it possible. Instinct has to be quantifiable somehow within science. There's got to be something there that facilitates that compulsion. And like I said, things like magnetic fields and day-night cycles are seemingly what that is for birds. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Tomorrow's Saturday. So tomorrow's actually snake feeding, so if that sounds interesting for you, tune in tomorrow at 3:30, and we'll be doing a snake feeding here. We'll be feeding all 5 of the snakes. Probably be me again doing that show. Headwaters Science Center is open right now, and I gotta say, if you're somebody who is looking to dodge the crowds, this is absolutely the time of year to be coming in. The school year, we see a big dip in our traffic, so if you're somebody who's like, "Ooh, I've always wanted to go in there, but it seems like it's really busy every time I go in there," and I go, maybe not. Come now. Come in September, October. This is our slowest time of the year. And we are open 7 days a week, so 9:30 to 5, Monday through Saturday, and then 1 to 5 on Sunday.